the New World or America was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492, they established rich mines as well as plantations. They were growing crops such as tobacco, sugarcane, ginger in these plantations. As the war becomes intense, colonialism. This refers to the direct political rules of a country by a foreign state or by a powerful state in Africa. It came into existence as a result of the scramble for and the partitions of Africa. The scramble for and partition of Africa. This refers to the competitions among European powers to occupy territories in Africa and the subsequent division of Africa among European powers. The only two countries that have never been scrambled and partitions were Ethiopia and Liberia. After the scramble for and the partition of Africa, then came colonialism. Colonialism refers to the direct political rules of a country by a foreign state or by a powerful state. The effectiveness of colonialism could be traced as far back in 1880s. During these times, the European powers were keen interest to occupy territories in Congo because Congo was blessed with too much of natural resources. In order to avoid the European powers going into war, the then Vice Chancellor of Germany called Otto von Bismarck, he invited the European powers who were interested in occupying territories in Africa. The British attended the Berlin Conference. The Portuguese also attended the Berlin Conference. The Germans as well as the Dutch also attended the Berlin Conference. In this conference, the map of Africa was brought out, and Africa was demarcated, or Africa was divided among European powers. Then the countries that were colonized by the British, it included the Gambia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, as well as Liberia in West Africa. The French were able to colonize Senegal, Mali, Guinea-Conakry, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and many other countries. Then the Portuguese were able to colonize Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. The Germans also colonized Tanganyika, now called Tanzania. So colonialism could be traced, or colonialism started in 1880s. Reasons for the British occupations of the Gambia. One of the reasons why the British decided to occupy the Gambia, one, in search of market. After the industrial revolutions, the Europeans were producing too much of goods. So they need a place where they can able to sell those surplus goods that they were producing. Then they decided to occupy or to colonize the Gambia in order to sell their surplus goods into the country. Now, two, in search of raw material. Most of the raw material that the British used in order to transform them into finished or semi-finished goods are from Africa. During those times, they were mining or exploiting our minerals here in the country. And those minerals are being exported to Europe in order to be transformed into finished goods. It's also another reason why the British decided to occupy the Gambia. Three, they occupied the Gambia, or they colonized the Gambia as a result of territorial expansion. Because they believe the more territories you colonize, the more powerful you become. That's why the British were able to colonize the country. The French, they colonized Senegal. The Portuguese colonized Portugal. The Portuguese colonized Guinea-Bissau. And the Germans colonized Tanganyika. Because these European powers, they believe in European superiority. The more territories you colonize, the more powerful you become. 4, slave trade. The Europeans were in need of slaves, that is the human power, to work in the plantations. When the New World or America was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492, they established rich mines as well as plantations. They were growing crops such as tobacco, sugarcane, ginger in these plantations. As the war becomes intense, they decided to go elsewhere to find people who can able to do this work in these plantations. This was one of the reasons why they came into Africa and in the Gambia. They captured the able men and women, chained them, shackled, shipped and transported to the New World called the Middle Passage. 5, the Soninke-Maraba War. They also occupied the Gambia in order to end the intertribal war in the country. Because during those times there was intertribal war, for example, the Soninke-Maraba War. This was the war that transpired between the between the Soninkes and also the Marabouts. The Soninkes were the non-believers, while the Marabouts were the Islamic scholars. This war transpired in 1850, which led to the demise of many people in the country. The European or the British intervened in order to stop or to prevent this war from expanding across the entire land and the breadth of the country. So these are some of the reasons why the British decided to occupy the country, called colonialism. Please don't forget to like the video. During the colonial era in the country, there are many factors that affected the British occupations of the Gambia as they are colonized. When the British colonized the country called the Gambia, there are many factors or many problems that they encounter during those times. So one of the factors that affect the British occupations of the Gambia as they are colonies was hostile attacks. Because when the British came in the Gambia and settled in the coastal areas, they changed the direction of trade from the interior to the coastal areas, which does not go down well with the Gambian people. And there was frequent hostile attacks. There was raids and riots from the European or from the African people to the Gambian people to the British. That's why came a war called the Barra War of 1831. So this was the war that transpired between the British and the people of the Gambia. It's also as a result of colonialism. Because the Gambian people, they dislike the European presence in the country. So that's why during those times, there was frequent raids and riots against the European powers. 2. The Soninke Maraba War. This war also affected the British occupations of the Gambia as they are colonized. Because this war, it hindered the movement of the British from one geographical locations to the other, which also affected the British occupations of the Gambia as a colony. 3. Poor transportations network during their stay in the Gambia. They find it very difficult to fly from one part of the country to another. Because when they came, they introduced their system of administration called the Indirect rule system. In this system, they appoint people called the traveling commissioners. And the traveling commissioners in the Gambia at that time were Silva and Sidwell. These people find it very difficult to travel from one interior of the country to another, because there were very bad road network in the country. 5. Communication problems. The British find it very difficult to communicate with the Gambian people effectively and efficiently, because they can't speak our indigenous language and we can also speak the European language, which also hindered the British effective occupations of the Gambia as a colony. 6. Harsh climatic conditions and disease. Many Europeans died in the country as a result of our harsh climatic conditions. There was high infestation of mosquitoes, which do cause a sickness to them called malaria. Many of them perished in the Gambia. Many of them perished in the Gambia. These are some of the factors that affect the British occupations of the Gambia as they are colonies during the colonial period of the 1880s. The method used by the British to colonize the Gambia during when the Gambia was colonized by the British at that time. The British decided to adopt certain methods or strategies in order to colonize the Gambia, because they know that there was high level of hostile attacks. There was Soninke Maraba War. There was harsh climatic conditions. In knowing all these things, they decided to adopt certain methods in order to colonize the country. One of the methods used by the British to colonize the Gambia was treaty. When they came, they signed an agreement with our kings and chiefs in order for them to be given some part of our land. That's why in 1823, the king of Barra called Brungai Sonko signed an agreement that gave State Mile to the British, and also came in 1816. A British captain called Captain Alexander Grant decided to go to Batos and sign an agreement with the king of Banjul or with the king of Congo called Tumani Bojang. That gave Batos to the British, and that's where the British stayed. So one of the methods used by the British to colonize the Gambia was treaty. Now 2, conquest. The other methods or strategies used by the British to control or to colonize the Gambia was conquest. Because when they came with their guns, arms and ammunition. They will attack a particular areas where they want to settle and remove the people, and they stayed in a particular territory or area. So it's called conquest. It's also another method used by the British to colonize the Gambia. 3, introduction of Western educations. When they came, and obtained Banjul in 1816. The governor of Banjul, called Sir Charles McCarthy, he decided to go to Britain and appeal to the Christian missionaries for them to come to the Gambia, for them to introduce Western education as well as Christianity. Following that appeal, the Christian missionaries also started coming into the Gambia. The first batch of missionaries that arrived in the Gambia were called the Methodists. When they came, they established schools. The first school established by the Methodists was called the Methodist Boys High School in Banjul. And in the later years, they also decided to establish another school called the Methodist Girls High School. These two schools are later joined together. It's now called the Gambia Senior Secondary School. Then another batch of Christian missionaries also arrived in the country called the Roman Catholics. When they also came, they established schools and clinics. A school was built called St. Joseph, St. Augustine's, and also St. Peter's. Another batch of missionaries also arrived who were invited by the governor of Banjul, called Sir Charles McCarthy. They were called the Anglicans. They also established schools and churches in the country. Then the 7 Days Adventure, as a batch of missionaries also arrived and established Western educations. And this Western education being established, it allowed our Gambian people to get enrolled into the school. So it's also another method used by the British to colonize the Gambia. 4. Introduction of Western culture and civilization. When they came in the Gambia and settled in Batos, they introduced their culture, meaning their mode of dressing and their way of lifestyle, which the Gambian people adopted, and also it contributed immensely to colonialism. The other method also adopted by the British in order to colonize the country was called legitimate trade. Legitimate trade was the trade in goods and services. They will bring in their goods into the country and exchange it with other goods into the country in order to prevent or to stop the abolitions of, in order to stop slave trade. So legitimate trade also was another strategy adopted by the British in order to colonize the country. The other method also used by the British was division and rule. They decided to divide the country into colony and also protectorate in order for them to easily colonize the country. So the colony was headed by the governor, Sir Charles McCarthy at that time, and also the protectorate was headed by the traveling commissioners. So these were some of the methods used by the British to effectively occupy or to colonize the Gambia. The indirect rule system. This was a system used by the British to administer their colonies in Africa or in the Gambia. It's also a system used by the British to rule their colonies with the use of our kings, chiefs, and also traditional rulers. Indirect rule system. This was a system used by the British to administer their colonies with the use of our local traditional rulers, for example, our kings and chiefs. When the Gambia was colonized by the British adopted a system of governance or administrations called the direct and the indirect rule system. The direct rule system was a system used by the British to administer the colonies or the crown colony. And this crown colonies was governed by the governor. During the colonial period, there were many governors in the Gambia. The first governor was Governor Lelwen. He was the first governor that served in the Gambia. The Gambia also had other governors such as Sir Charles McCarthy, Sir R.S. Rendell, Sir Armitage also was a governor in the country. But the direct rule system was a system used by the British to rule the crown colony. The crown colony was the areas at that time where the British stations, for example, Banjul or Batos. And this crown colonies was headed or was overseen by the governor. Then the indirect rule system. This was the system used by the British to administer their colonies in the protectorate. And in the protectorate, they would use our local traditional rulers to rule their Gambian subject, but with the supervision of the British official or the traveling commissioners. During those times, the traveling commissioners in both the South Bank and the North Bank were Silver and Sidwell, who were killed in the Sankani incident of 1899. The Sankani incident was an incident that transpired between the British, or is an incident that transpired between the Soninkes who live in Sankandi, between the Soninkes who live in Jataba and the Marabut who live in Sankandi. There was a piece of land that lies between Sankandi and Jataba. The Soninke Marquez claimed to be the owner of this piece of land. Likewise, the mother must also claim to be the owner of this piece of land. As the quarrel grew out of hand, the matter was referred to the traveling commissioners of the South Bank on Sidwell. So Sidwell invariably used two parties, which resulted to a bloodshed called the Sankandi Crisis of 1899. The reasons for the introduction of the indirect rule system in the Gambia. 1. Language barrier. Because when the British came and colonized the Gambia, they wanted to effectively occupy the Gambia, but they realized they find it very difficult to communicate with the Gambian people effectively and efficiently. They decided to use our local traditional rulers in order to rule the Gambian people. So one of the reasons for the indirect rule system was language barrier. 2. Poor transportation network. They find it very difficult to move from one part of the country to another with the use of transport. Because the Gambia at that time, we are having a very bad road network. They decided to introduce the indirect rule system in order to use our local traditional rulers to rule the Gambian people. 3. Harsh climatic conditions. The conditions in the Gambia was not favorable at that time, which resulted to the death of many British personnel in the country. That's why they named Africa as the white man's graveyard. 4. Lack of enough British personnel. The British personnel were unwilling to come into the Gambia at that time, so there were only few British officials in the country. That's why they decided to use our local traditional rulers to use our Gambian people. 5. Hostile attacks. There was frequent raids and riots against the British people who were present in the country. These are some of the reasons why the British introduced a system of administration called the indirect rule system in the country. The British structure of the indirect rule system, which means how they organize themselves in order to administer or to rule the Gambian people. On top of the British structure of administration was the monarch. The monarch was the Queen Elizabeth. The monarch was the Queen Elizabeth. Now, the other structure or the other ways in which the British arranged themselves or organized themselves in order to rule the Gambia was the Secretary of State for Colonies. The function of the Secretary of State for Colonies is to monitor the activities of the governor at the time. So the Secretary of State for Colonies was a personal representative of the monarch, then the governor. The governor at that time in Banjul during this indirect rule system was called Sir R.B. Lelwe. And from him then we have Sir Charles McCarthy. And the roles or the function of the governors during the indirect rule system. 1, they serve as the personal representative of the monarch. They represent the monarch who was the queen at that time in the country. 2, they formulate and execute policies. The governors were responsible for the formulations and the executions of policies. 3, they also exercise the prerogative of mercy. For instance, if an individual commits crime in the colonies, then the governor has the sole responsibility or the sole right to forgive or to pardon that particular individual. 4, he was also responsible for the collection of tax. The governor collects tax within his jurisdiction. 5, he also allocates land to the needy people. The governor gives out land to the people in the country at that time. So these are some of the roles or the function of the governor during the indirect rule system in the country. Now to the traveling commissioners. During the colonial period or the colonial rule in the country, the Gambia was divided into 2, the protectorate and the colony. The protectorate was governed by the traveling commissioners, and also the colony was governed by the governor. Now the functions of the traveling commissioners. 1, they were responsible for the settlement of disputes in the protectorate. For instance, if there is a dispute that the kings and chiefs cannot be able to settle, so the matter could be referred to the traveling commissioners, Silver and Sidwell. 2, they were also responsible for the boundary demarcations. They saw borders between a village or they saw boundaries between one country to another. 3, they were also responsible for the collection of tax. They collect tax to the local people and the money is now given to the governor at the time. 5, They also were responsible. They were also responsible for the appointment and the dismissal of the chiefs. For instance, in the Sankandi crisis, the king of Sankandi called Bori Banadabo was dismissed. Because the traveling commissioner, they have the right, or they have the duty, the right, to appoint and also dismiss the chiefs at that time. So these are some of the functions of the traveling commissioners during the colonial period in the country. Now, to the roles or the duty of the chiefs, because our local traditional rulers were involved in the colonial period, for example, our kings and chiefs. One of the functions of the chief were collection of tax. They also collect tax from the indigenous people. 2, they also settle disputes in the village or in the community. If there is a dispute or quarrel between the people or between family members, the chief could settle those disputes. 3, they were also responsible for the allocation of land. They give lands to the needy farmers in order for them to venture into agriculture. They were also responsible, or they also take part in community works or community service. For instance, if there is a construction of bridge or construction of bridge that is to happen in other countries, the chiefs will come and also partake in the construction of bridges. So these are some of the functions of the governor, the function of the traveling commissioners, and the functions of the chiefs. Now to the advantages or the good part of the indirect rule system. The good part of the indirect rule system. 1, it reduced the cost of running a government. Because in the indirect rule system, the British were unwilling to spend money in their colonies that they colonized at that time. So it reduces the cost of running a government. 2, it was as the indirect rule system was seen as a form of self-government. Because in this system, our local traditional rulers were allowed to rule us indirectly with the supervision of the British official. So it was a form of local self-government. 3, it recognized and modernized our traditional institutions. Because the indirect rule system, it allowed our kings and chiefs to execute our traditional culture and custom to the people. The disadvantages of the indirect rule system. There is the negative aspect of the indirect rule system in the Gambia. 1, it leads to economic exploitations. Because people were paying tax to the colonial government and there were little developments in the country. That's why the people of the Gambia were very angry. They were tired of colonialism. That's why our African leaders, the educated elites, they could not stave off the temptation. They decided to agitate and they formed trade unions. The first trade union which was formed in the Gambia was called the Potters Trade Union. It was established by Edward Francis Small in 1929 in Batos Banjul. And the slogan of this trade union was no taxation without proper representations. People should not pay tax until or unless they know where their monies are being spent. They organized a strike. And in this strike, the workers came. They decided to agitate against the colonial government. And the colonial government or authority decided to send the soldiers, the British soldiers, to go in order to put off the strike. When they came, they opened fire. And our Gambian people also decided to use stones, sticks, to retaliate back, which leads to the death of many of the Gambian people during this strike. The indirect rule system led to economic exploitation. 2, it also led to the exclusions of our educated elites. Our educated elites such as Edward Francis Small, Kairaba Jawara, Mamadou E. Jallow, Reverend Jesse Faye were not allowed to take part in any political activities of the state. It led to the exploitation, it led to the exclusions of our educated elites at that time. 3, it also did little to recognize our local and traditional institutions. Because all our authorities or all our laws were made by the European powers at that time. So little was done in order to recognize and modernize our traditional institutions. 4, it leads to the disunities. It leads to disunity. Because when the British came, some of the government supported the British coming into the country, while some of the government also did not support their presence in the country. So it leads to the disunity in the country at that time. And 5, it leads to discriminations between the blacks and the whites. It it leads to discriminations between the blacks and the whites. Because the blacks in the country were not allowed to take part in any political activities. So the whites were the one controlling the executive and the legislative councils, which also a contributing factor that leads to nationalist struggle and also the formation of trade union as well as political parties. The effects of colonialism in the Africa or in the Gambia. The effect or the impact of colonialism. One, it leads to the introduction of Western educations. Because when the Gambia was colonized, they decided to build schools in the country. Hermitage was established, St. Augustine's, St. Joseph, in order to introduce Western educations in the country. Two, it leads to the introduction of Western culture. They decided to introduce their culture, their lifestyle, and to civilize the Gambian people. Three, it leads to the introduction of Christianity. Christianity was introduced in the country. Four, it leads to the economic exploitations. Our resources, our natural resources as minerals were mined and taken into Europe. Our people were paying tax, but they were seeing only few developments in the country at that time. So, which is also an effect of colonialism. Five, it leads to the exclusions of our educated elite. The first Gambians who acquired Western educations were not allowed to partake in the political discussions of the country. So this is all about indirect rule system and colonialism. And please don't forget to like and watch as well as subscribe to our videos.